see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Nice to see everyone here this morning. We have a nice turnout. I woke up 3 or 4 times last night when my lights were coming on and going off and coming on and going off. Then a big oak tree branch fell down in front of me about 20 feet on the way in, so I thought, gee, if I get here today, I'll be a lucky person. On the way in, though, I heard of a finding, I guess, of an American pilot back in Croatia in World War II that had been just found, and I guess his body is being shipped back here to the Pittsburgh area. I just heard that this morning, and his name just happens to be Ford, so if you hear of anybody named Ford who's coming home from Croatia, there's no relation to me, but I thought that today must be a special day. I just wanted to make an announcement about the luncheon coming up on December the 8th, the 14th, I'm sorry, the 14th. For those who have never been to the luncheon, it's a very nice affair. It's over at the Doubletree, across the river, up the hill, on the other side of Robert Morris, and it's very nice. It's a nice location. They serve a nice luncheon, and it's just been a good activity for the men's club.
It's got a bar too.
It has a pay bar, yeah. I'm sure that if you haven't been to the luncheon before, you would enjoy it, and bring another member of the club along, and see Ray Copper before you go, because he's the one that collects the money for whether you eat or not. There's going to be some entertainment from, up on the hill from Masonic Village. They've had this fellow up there, his name is Zinzer, and he plays the piano. He's played here before, once or twice, I believe. And but I'm sure you'll enjoy it. So before you leave today, if you're thinking about going to this luncheon, see Ray, because we only have, after today, we only have, because of Thanksgiving, we only have 2 men's club meetings before that activity, and then there's only 1 more after today. Dan Simkins is our speaker for today, and he's resurrected from back in World War I, back in the trench warfare days, which, you know, I keep thinking of back there, and must have been terrible. And he is going to give a presentation on some of the problems that these poor souls had overseas, and has just agreed to answer some questions after his performance is over. So Dan, I'll let you take over. And
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you for coming out. My name's Dan Simkins. Right out of the, just to start with, I'm always intimidated to give this talk to your generation because you're much closer to what I'm going to speak of. So either, and I don't know if anyone here is a World War II vet, but I know that the surplus of World War I, you probably played with as kids because it was everywhere, right? So today they're more rare and treasured, but you probably had fathers and uncles that served in the war that you may have heard stories. So I've only studied it. You guys are closer to hearing the firsthand experiences. So just to give you, how do I go? Okay. Just to give my background, I'm from Pittsburgh. I grew up in the South Hills. I, at a time, lived in Lawrenceville for about 11 years, and I was president of the Lawrenceville Historical Society for about 8. And this is a picture of me at Allegheny Cemetery. So I got interested in World War I reenacting from a friend who was doing research for a book, and the internet he didn't have the internet access because it wasn't as widespread. And I saw that there was reenactment, and I always wanted to reenact, and I thought, well, people just do Civil War. But when I saw World War I, I said to him, you know what, if you're interested in doing this, I'll do it with you. He was more interested in World War I at the time than I was, but he sort of pulled me in. And so I reenacted with an organization called the Great War Association, GWA. They have land, it's basically farmland, out about an hour north of Gettysburg. So when you think of reenactment, right, so usually World War I are the only reenactment group that own their own land. Every other reenactment group just needs a field to march in and to point, line up and point their rifles at. But in World War I, you can't say, can I borrow your land, and then dig a bunch of trenches in it. And so it's kind of a permanent installation. And what's interesting is they do have a very impressive area that's been trenched. People have built structures that are period. There's barbed wire everywhere and poison ivy, which doesn't make it pleasant. And there's actually film groups that will rent this land because it looks so authentic. They have a gate, a parking lot, and when you walk through this gate, they don't want to see anything modern. So it's truly an experience like stepping back in time. But it's not available for the public to go and watch this. And the main reason isn't that they don't want people to come see it, it's that they can't afford the insurance, right? Because you have craters, trenches, barbed wire, and if anyone trips and falls, you're done. So that's why it has to be sort of a hobbyist type event. So this is a picture of me in Allegheny Cemetery. So I march every year in the Memorial Day Parade. Now, I would wear the uniform up until a few years ago. I have 2 kids. My son, who's now in high school, fits my original uniform. So now he's a doughboy, and he marches because he looks closer to a recruit than I do. I need an officer's uniform or something at my age. But that was probably one of the last times I marched as the doughboy myself. Now I live in Ben Avon, right down the river here, and I am involved with the Avonworth Historical Society. I'm on their board as well. I think it's been about 3 years. So let me get started.
It's the middle button there.
Yeah, okay. So just to give a quick intro to the photos, you're going to see photos throughout this, and it's a blend of real World War I and then what I've taken at reenactments. And so if anything's in black and white or a sepia, right, that brown tone, it's an original World War I. If it's tinted blue or a full color photograph, would obviously be reenactors. Because if you look at this, it's pretty impressive to see that the sights and the sounds and a lot of the experience were what they experienced. The only thing missing was, the stench of death, the disease, the rats, and all the other horrible things, but that's... I'm not going to go too much into why the war was started. And again, just to remind everyone, which we're all aware, we just had the 100th anniversary of the armistice this past Sunday. I don't know, I know that the Allegheny Cemetery rang bells at 11 a.m. to mark that. I don't know if anyone else had any other activities. But just the idea that you had Germany, the Austro-Hungarians, who had conquered Serbia. This is the Gavrilo Princip, who, why is that window popped up? I'm trying to get that out of the way. Oh, there it is. You know, assassinated Franz Ferdinand, and there was this conflict, and basically it was a breakdown of treaties. Germany said to Austria-Hungary, we'll support you. The Serbians had the Russians, will support you. And then Germany goes through Belgium into France, and the British get involved, and it just falls apart, and everyone starts fighting. And of course, at that time, it was a European war. The Americans had no interest in joining. And what also is interesting is that you know, we were business partners to both sides. Germany wasn't this evil entity that had to be stopped. It was purely the Europeans were, you know, fighting as usual, and we'll do business with both sides. And so, again, that's the European War. And so with the idea of the Lusitania, the Germans with submarine warfare, which was new, sank the Lusitania because they thought, okay, the Americans are taking supplies to the British, we can't have that. And so they sunk a ship, and I think about 128 Americans died. And a lot of people look at with the Zimmerman telegraph, if anyone's familiar with that. The Germans reached out to Mexico because they were suspecting that the Americans may get in this fight. So they thought, let's get the Mexicans to attack the United States and keep them busy, and maybe that'll keep them out of our hair. So there was a telegraph sent to them to explore that, and it got intercepted by a British spy, and that's probably what triggered that, and the continued submarine warfare. They realized, okay, we have to get involved. It's just amusing that Mexico contemplated attacking the United States and realized not only would we most likely not defeat the United States, which they were pretty positive of, but even if they could gain ground, they felt there was no way they could hold it, because you had an armed populace that would have just risen up and taken back what they took. Also, the idea that it's a European war, and with Woodrow Wilson originally running on keeping us out of it, and then finding himself pulled in. And we were only in the war for 19 months, and that's from declaration, right? So once we declared war, it took a while for our war machine to get started and organized and to go over. So why the doughboy? The term doughboy for a soldier is basically unknown. It's debatable. I'm going to start with the most likely reason and then work my way down to probably the more, not absurd, but longer stretches. They've actually traced the term doughboy back to the Civil War, where writing through the notes of officers as they were, you know, summarizing battles and whatnot, they would actually, there was a few times, it's not often, but they would use the term doughboy to reference a soldier. But it hadn't caught on to the broader populace, so I think it was just not given much attention. And even today, that's not very well known. But what happened is I think as time went on, maybe it was in the military that they did reference doughboys lightheartedly, maybe here and there, but it wasn't the nomenclature of the time. And perhaps with the war, it somehow got out, and then it was adopted by the media and whatnot. So that's the main reason, the most likely source of the word doughboy. Some other reasons are during the Mexican War, when they were chasing after Pancho Villa, that when they were in Mexico, the soldiers, there's that, the dust is very dry, and it has a certain hue, and that's what the Mexicans would make their homes of this kind of mud, and they were called dobo huts. And so the soldiers marching through, you know, miles and miles in the dust, getting caked all over them, people said, oh, well, they look like Doughboy huts because they were the same color. So they became doughboys. That's possible as well. Another reason is that these Salvation Army women would, when they went over to support the soldiers, they would make donuts, and so that was a big treat for the doughboys. And is that a reason? So then they just called them doughboys because they loved to eat these donuts so much. And then the last piece was, and I think this is the least likely, is the buttons on the uniforms were a little bit rounded, and so they thought they looked like little dough balls, and so they said those are doughboys. So I think that's the least likely, but it's most likely that it was just something in the military during the Civil War that carried forward, and then as it became a broader war, more popular, the term somehow got out and was used. The first battle experience was at Cantigny. So they were sending over the soldiers, and Cantigny was just a mountain, like a hillside with a town on top that the Germans were holding. And it was on May 28th, 1918, right? So we declared war in 1917, and as they started shipping guys over in November, December, it wasn't until May they saw their first action. And really that was to help lift the spirits of the British and the French, which were completely beaten, right? I mean, not beaten, but just they've just been dealing with this for years, since 1914, and they just weren't as into the fight at that point. So this was to help lift their spirits. The Americans did take the hill and successfully held the ground, and so the Americans came in as fresh, probably more energized and ready to fight, and from there, of course, we helped turn the tide of the war. So industrialized war, so this is where we're going to get into, this is like the first modern war. When you look at World War II, there was a lot of lessons learned from World War I. And when they started World War I, they still had that old mentality that came from the Civil War traditions, where you line up two sides and you start marching towards each other, firing into each other, into the lines. And so I'm using the French uniforms here. That's right, I have a pointer. This is the start. So this is 1914, 15, 16, 17, 18. So here's the start of the war. And so what you can see is that there was still a lot of the older, very decorative, very proper uniforms, very flashy. But what they've quickly learned is that with the accuracy of the rifles and then with the machine guns and everything else, wearing bright red on a battlefield is not a good idea, because you're basically saying, shoot me now, here I am. And so you can see how quickly they dropped that red. And again, this is like every war, right? Everyone says, this will be over in a few months, we'll lick them, and then we'll be home for Christmas. But, and also you'll notice that there's the cloth hat, which over time, right, so the idea of needing an actual helmet to protect your head, because not that a helmet necessarily would protect a soldier's head from a direct shot, but it was really to protect from the shrapnel that was flying around and the debris. So they quickly, you can see from 14 to 15, it was about 1916, they learned that lesson. Okay, we need something harder on our heads to protect. And so you can see that, and also the equipment got a little bit more, sophisticated with the times. You can see a gas mask, which we'll get into, but, so that's that. I'm also going to show the Germans as well. Now, the Germans didn't start out as flashy as the French, but what you'll notice is these helmets with the spikes. So if you see pictures of Germany in the beginning of the war, they have those types of helmets with the big, fancy show off, these nice spikes like they're peacocks or something. Well, number one, when you're crawling under barbed wire, the spikes would get all caught up, and there that goes. So you'll see that they quickly start getting smaller and smaller and then disappear. Also, those helmets, they're just leather. So again, a little bit better than cloth, but really nothing to write home about. So over time, they adopted a helmet look, which you can see is very similar to the World War II helmet. The Germans were very good engineers, and you can see by the helmet design where the sides of the helmets offer additional coverage around the ears, right? The Americans had a nice flat, and the British, well, your ears aren't protected, the sides of the head. And they say that Even from World War II on, the Americans adopted a similar. They tried to modify the helmets to do more protection around the head. You may know this, if not, one of the differences you can tell between a World War II and a World War I are these vent holes on the sides. World War I, they had these vent holes. World War II, they got rid of them. I'm not sure why, but I mean, I'm sure that's for ventilation to keep you cool. I don't think they've added anything. Maybe they felt, heck, you don't really need the ventilation as much, or maybe that was something else that got caught on barbed wire. So we'll start analyzing industrialized war. So the idea is that when the war started, right, they just weren't used to the amount of lead flying in their direction. So people quickly started to dig in, and then over time the trenches got deeper, and they actually got more sophisticated. So this is a shot, and you can see, wrong button. Here, it's early in the war, they have the old helmets with the spikes. Even the trenches are shallower, so there's a lot more movement at this point. But here, you can see higher walls, sandbags, wood. They have these little bunkers built in. As the war progressed, the trenches at the front that would get taken over constantly had no wood, no structure. They were muddy, dirty, just holes in the ground. That was it. And it was because when you see pictures of these bunkers and a lot of the wood structures, those were the trenches towards the back, right? Because they weren't going to put all this work into building a trench nicely just to have the enemy take it over. So that's why they would put more of that effort in the back where the officers are, where they're making plans, maybe where they would pull the soldiers back towards. So that was the idea of trench warfare. And then again, the lesson learned from World War II is that you don't make much progress when you're sitting in a ditch. And the war became mobile, which we'll talk about a little bit more. Oh, and here again, so this is this would have been a front trench, right? It's completely dirt, mud, and grime. And here, this is in the back. Also, you'll notice here's a guy shaving. There's people standing up and looking over the edge. This was most likely taken as just a photo shoot. One thing you did not do is look over the trench because the snipers were looking for people peeking over the edges. So they had those little periscope boxes to look around. Snipers were constantly on the lookout, even to the point where they didn't even want you smoking at night, because if they would just target the glow of a butt and they could take you out, and it happened a lot. So again, you could tell this was taken after the war because they're boldly looking up over the trench, not concerned of sniper fire. Also the guns, right? So the machine guns. There was a Gatling gun in the Civil War. It was big and heavy, but here was the real first war where you had handheld machine guns. And again, a lot of them were, they're still learning how to develop reliable firearms. This is called a show. It's a French machine gun. So it's one of the earlier designs. The Americans hated that rifle because it always jammed. It was just a piece of garbage. And they didn't even want to go into battle with a gun that was most likely going to jam because they knew their life was at risk. So they would rather have the bolt action rifle that was reliable than go in there with this that was going to jam on them. A lot of reenactors are military, police. A lot of them are FFL dealers. So there would be people at these reenactments with real machine guns, and all the guns you would just fire blank ammunition. So that's why I say when you go there, it was the sights and the sounds were very accurate. So this was a collector, so that was an actual show, fully automatic, and he was demonstrating it. And of course, it jammed during the demonstration. You can also see these mounted machine guns, which was carried over in World War II as well. And then the idea of the bayonet, right? So the bayonet was still nice and long, like you would see in older warfare. And I think by World War II, they got shorter. And even now, they look like just knives that you would stick on the end of your rifle. Bombs, which became more accurate, longer range, probably more destructive during World War I. So you have, these ground mortars. Oops. larger, like the cannons had changed into those types of larger guns that had larger range. They would even create massive cannons that could shoot for miles. The hand grenades became more sophisticated. They did have hand grenades in the Civil War, but I don't know if I use an example, but the Germans would have a long stick where they would throw their grenades during World War I. And then, of course, with the introduction to air warfare, bombs are now coming from overhead, so they're coming from all directions. One thing about the helmet is, this is probably where the helmet would come in from shrapnel if you would get covered. With a helmet, when you have a strap, so the World War I's would wear the helmet and they would have the strap around their chin, which was called parade march. They would not wear this strap under the chin during a battle, because as shrapnel would hit the ground and you would have it bouncing up, if it would hit the rim of the helmet, it would rip your head right off your shoulders. So they would move the strap to behind their heads so that if something hit the helmet, it would just pop off their head. So that, and a lot of that was with grenades, because it was a smaller. The tanks, this is the introduction to the tank. These were developed by the British, and with the British, right, they were most popularly known for their navy. So when they first developed the tank, they were actually they wanted to call it the land ship, right? So they were developing land ships because they were very naval based. And the word tank was actually a code word as they were developing this, to keep it top secret, and the reason they used the word tank is that it would look like these steel water tanks for water storage, and then the word just stuck. So again, you can see in the beginning of the war, tanks were very large, very heavy, very slow, and just a horrible experience for the crew inside. So they would really just move at a walk's pace at best. So they were so big and heavy. And also the armor couldn't stop some of the larger shells. So it was really for small arms and shrapnel. And also, so they were vulnerable to direct hit by artillery. But the one thing about these tanks is that inside, it was just a horrible experience for the crew. The temperatures would get up over 100 degrees, 122 degrees. You would have gas fumes, the fumes from firing their cannon. So it would be hot and just a completely toxic environment, to the point where whole crews would just pass out in the tank. Or they would be in the tank for so long fighting that when the fighting was over and they would pop out of the tent and hit fresh air, they would black out. So it was quite a miserable experience. But as the war got on, and again, with the technology improving, tanks got smaller and faster and lighter, because they realized, okay, all this armor isn't going to stop artillery, but let's get some speed. So that, again, there are a lot of lessons learned during that war. Poisonous gases. So here you can see we did reenactments, and these are the Germans. With reenactors, we had Germans, Austrians, British, Australians, there was French, Russian. I mean, you had it all. So it's quite an experience, and I have some photos of those groups. But with the gas mask, this was called the chemist's war, right? So the chemists were learning how to poison the other side. And in the early years of the war, when they started using gas, it was really an irritant, just to make their eyes watery and burn a little bit, just to keep them distracted so they could go in and attack. But as the war progressed, they got more sophisticated and more lethal, and so the gas really became poison. And that's where these gas masks developed. And here's the interesting with the horse. These gas masks were atrocious. I don't know if anyone here with the military and if you were issued when you served, but they were pretty archaic. And I think I have some photos, so I'll touch upon that more. But what's interesting about the war, and they said this towards the end of the war, that even though there was trench warfare, it did towards the end get a little bit looser, where there was more mobility on both sides. But what's interesting is when you look at Hitler in World War II, one of the reasons for the Blitzkrieg and the idea that they outlawed poisonous gas, but Hitler was obviously not going to pay attention to any of those regulations. But the reason he did not use poisonous gas was because, and this was something they suffered in World War I, when you're going to gas the other side, the first thing you need to do is lick your finger and check the way the air's going. Because if you throw gas that way and the wind's coming this way, you've just irritated your own men. So that was one thing about the gas. And the other thing is okay, so you bomb the area and you give it a few minutes, and then once you go running in to take it, well, the gas is laying on the ground, it's on the plants, it's on everything, and then it irritates your own soldiers over there. And it would take a while for that to dissipate. And so that's why Hitler, with the Blitzkrieg, didn't gas, because he knew if I gas that, I can't go running in immediately after to take it because I'll irritate my own men. So really it wasn't, oh, I'm following the rules of warfare. It was purely, logistical or strategic. Oh, so here's the gas mask. So what's interesting is when it was an irritant, right, these gas masks were just a piece of cloth over the face. And this, you think about how horrible war is, but what they would do is this is the French, maybe the Americans, by the time the Americans got involved, we didn't have to go through this. But in the early war, what they would do is they would take this piece of cloth and urinate on it, because the ammonia in urine would help cancel out the irritant, the poisonous gas was coming in. So that's pretty bad. And then you can see as they were experimenting with different gas masks, and this is blue, so this is a reenactor. And even those gas masks were horrible. I mean, there wasn't a seal, they were loose cloth, the goggles would fog up, they would, provide you with a stick to try to rub on the glass for an anti-fogging agent. They would have a mouthpiece that had a hose connected to a can. In this can, that's in this bag, it was filled with almond shells. That was what helped, pull the poison out of the gas that was coming through the can. And then they had these little pinchers that were supposed to pinch the nose, and that didn't work. What's interesting is at the beginning of the war, and here's another thing that was learned and then carried forward, if you look at soldiers in Civil War, you look at soldiers in the French, and you look at them in the Russians in particular, you would have fully bearded men going in the battle. It was the gas mask that got rid of the beard, because what they were saying is you need to create as much of a seal around the face as possible, and the beard would push it out, and then gas would get in and you would be irritated. So it was in World War I when they said, okay, you have to be clean shaven. Now they did allow mustaches, but they could not go beyond the edge of your mouth. So you might see an officer or some of the soldiers would have a mustache. But when you look at pictures early on, the French and the Russians, they would always have these big full beards as they were going into battle. And then air warfare, which was new, right? So it started with balloons for observations, and even the early planes were sent up just to observe. And then they said, well, we're getting fired at. Okay, well, here's a revolver, shoot back. But then you had the opposing side with their airplanes with revolvers shooting at each other, and then they figured out how to mount machine guns onto these planes, and then they figured out, so then that's where you develop, all right, how do we protect our guy and kill more guys while we're over there? But it really started as reconnaissance, and so it is interesting to see how warfare developed. Here's a bomber, and also the concept of dog fighting, right? So that's your first experience, and I'm sure a lot of best practices and strategies were established in World War I that were carried over to World War II. And of course, that's pre-jet age. I'm sure the strategies in the jet age are quite different. So here's the World War I uniform. And so you can see here in 1914, this was purely, this is before we entered the war. So this is what a soldier would have. And as they progress, and so it was around here in 1917 where war was declared. So you see the equipment was pretty much the same. These hats here were really worn in the States, in the United States as they were training. Whoops, I keep hitting these buttons. But once they got overseas, it was where you would see in World War II, where it was just the cap, the flat cap that would go over the head. That's what they wore over in Europe. And they also, the Americans just adopted the design of the helmet from the British. Also some of the rifles, they had the Springfield, but they also developed an Enfield based off of a British Enfield. But of course, we increased the Enfield's caliber to .30-06, which is what the Springfield was. And then the gas mask. They also had the putties, the leg wraps. That was probably the last time they used those. Yeah, I'm not even sure. I know there's a lot of reasons for those putties, and that's definitely a carryover from previous uniforms, but the idea of keeping your pant legs from getting caught on things, keep your boots dry and whatnot, but they always tended to unravel, and I think by World War II they had canvas leggings or none at all. Here's the backpack, how it was kitted out. So each soldier would have half a pup tent, so they would share with another soldier. They had their mess kit, which was a flat can with a spoon, knife, and fork, and it would go in this pouch here. Here's the gas mask, matches, helmet, canteen, wire cutters, right, for barbed wire. So they would go on these night raids and be quiet, try to open up some barbed wire for when they plan to attack. Here's the shaving kit to keep them cleanly shaved, the leg wraps, trench knife, gauze, like a first aid kit for gauze. They also had a meat can for, they would either have meat or crackers or something in there. And then this can here it has two lids. There's a lid here and a lid here, and it was cut in half. Half was for coffee and the other half was for sugar. And then in the hollow cap on the one side, which was larger, is they would have some salt. And that was their pack. And I over-clicked it, and usually at this point I say, when you look at this design with the long, and here's a blanket as well, but there's this long bag and it wraps and you strap it up. Does anyone know the motivation of the design of that backpack, right? It's not a bag that you're sticking stuff in. You're putting it into onto a piece of canvas and then wrapping it up. If you saw the picture, the motivation for that design, or the inspiration, I should say, is the Indian papoose. So here you can see how American Indian culture influenced the design. But of course, after World War I think they realized that's not you can't be fast, right? You need to throw stuff in a bag and move. I think with all this wrapping, it probably slowed things down. So by World War II, they didn't have this type. But I thought that was an interesting design. Life at the front. So again, a lot of people think, first off, men were at the front for only about 3 weeks at most. You couldn't stay up at the front too long. I mean, there's the idea of shell shock and that whole thing. It was just so horrendous with the shelling that people would just mentally break down if they were there longer than 3 weeks. So they would cycle them out. So a lot of people who went to the front didn't necessarily see action. So there's a lot of waiting and how do you entertain yourself while not putting your head above the trench. And, when there was raining, they had trench foot, so constantly in puddles. Rats were everywhere. And the rats would get so bold that if you had some crumbs in your pocket, they would eat through their coats to get to the crumbs. In early days, right, the soldiers were so fed up, they would go to shoot the rats. And of course, the officer said, no, U.S. government spent good money for that bullet. You're not going to use it on a rodent. You're going to use it on a German soldier. So they were forbidden to shoot these rodents. So I'm sure they would do their best to stab and beat them with the butts of their rifles. So mealtime, so again, obviously you have to feed the troops. So they would have food brought up to the front and using their mess kits. So that's again, how do you use your time. When I was reenacting, I thought, I'm going to go there, I'm going to be running around, having a good time. And you did, but it was like the military. We'd go there and we would do a lot of waiting. And so I didn't do as much running around as I thought. And what also happened then is mealtime, and you would eat. And of course, they wanted things in cans without labels. It had to look as authentic as possible. A lot of sardines, they wanted you to use the keys, right, to wrap back the cover, because that was how cans were back then. But also the idea is that we were fortunate enough to have women would come and reenact as Red Cross or Salvation Army. And so we had these ladies came and made actual donuts from scratch. Big cast iron, pot filled with oil, just all day long making donuts. And they would stack them on the bayonets and take them to the front. That's how the soldiers did it back then. So of course I have a warm donut. So I'm sitting there in a trench eating donuts, snacking, and I actually would gain weight on these events. So that was... And mail call, right? So a lot of time by the soldiers were spent writing, which I'm sure was very common, again, in the military in general. Transportation, right? So with the advancement, with the technology of cars. So what's interesting is World War I had it all. They started with horses. They even had a cavalry, right? The very first battles were cavalry, which those got mowed down real fast. And they realized, all right, that's not a good idea. We can't do that. So then the horses went from being, these proud cavalry horses to just work labor. So they continue to use horses. And here you see with the gas mask, I think they still had on that to protect them. Automobiles, they would convert Model Ts into ambulances. And again, with my reenactment, part of the experience for me was that someone had found an old Model T in a barn, invested in putting it together, made it into an ambulance based off of plans, and I got to ride in that. It was a fantastic experience. But what's interesting is, what you learn, you never hear. You go, okay, an ambulance ride, that's nice. Well, it was one of the roughest rides I'd ever been on. I mean, a Model T, off-road, bump, and they even said that if you'd have to be careful because the soldiers could get injuries traveling in the ambulance to get back to where the medics were because it was so bumpy for these cratered grounds. Trains were used, right, not only for carrying and housing large weapons, which I know that I think Hitler did that in World War II as well with these big, large mounted cannons, but bicycles, motorcycles, and even motorcycles. Oh, this is a great idea. How do we get motorcycles to replace horses and charge into the front? And I think that didn't work out. They even had sidecars mounted with machine guns, but the riders were too exposed, so those were basically used for carrying messages in the back lines. And someone showed up with a 1918 Harley Davidson, completely redone. Just seeing him ride around on the grounds was quite an experience. And I actually got to see, I think in the last 2 years, I did it for about 5 years. The last 2 years, they did find guys with biplanes who reenacted to come and do little mock dog fights and throw flour sacks over. So that was a good experience. For me, the reason I had to stop was, one is I had kids, so my wife wasn't too excited when I would go run off and do this. And then the other one was, it was getting to the point where the experience was, there wasn't anything new. I mean, I enjoyed it, but I just wasn't learning and developing anything. And so at that point, it's like, okay, it costs money, it costs time, I have kids. So at that point, I decided, okay, I'll take a break. The Red Cross, just to give some tips on that, and I'm going to be wrapping up here shortly. At the beginning, the Red Cross was a very small organization that was local to the United States. And then as the war came on, they started doing fundraisers, and that gave them a huge influx of money to start really growing their ranks. What they did first was they created the SS Red Cross, which was what's termed a mercy ship. So that's this here. So that was their first thing, and I think that was even before the Americans got in the war. So they raised money, had a ship built, a hospital ship, and shipped off to help the Europeans with their sick. And so that's really where they started. And then I think at that point they grew to the point where then they just kept getting continued funding. Salvation Army, something similar. They first came to Europe in August of 1917, right? So as soon as we declare war, we're in there. Salvation Army immediately went over and started setting up. And they were there they would create these huts, and it was to serve donuts. They would have letterhead. They would try to make these little areas to be more like home, right, to their parents, that whole thing. And so what's interesting and impressive about them is that they got so far close to the front that it was actually this suppress the soldiers because they were in danger. You know, you can see she has a helmet, so they did get quite close to the front and tried to do their best to make life good for the soldiers. And the other thing about the Red Cross is they also had to set up hospital tents closer to the front. If anyone here is familiar, there's something called the Golden Hour. If anyone was injured in World War I with shrapnel, if they were treated within an hour, they would most likely survive. But even with a simple shrapnel wound, this is before penicillin. So what would happen is really the key to saving someone was to keep infection away. So you had to get that wound cleaned in an hour. So a lot of men would have died from a simple wound that could have easily been cleaned and bandaged, but it took hours to get them. And also what was interesting is the beginning of the war, with modern warfare, in the old days, they would have a hospital set up and they would say, okay, on a given battle, we might have 1,000 wounded soldiers, okay? Here it was tens of thousands of wounded soldiers. So where they first set up and said, okay, we're going to take care of the wounded, they were so overwhelmed, they had to quickly ramp up operation. And then also with the golden hour, right, to get the wounded back to where they could get taken care of, it took too long to get them from the front to the hospitals. So they had to get closer and closer to the front so that they could catch people in the golden hour. And also they had to grow their staff. So you would have people that, you know, when it began, you might have someone who, I've been a doctor for 20 years, I can take care of you. But now they just needed someone to patch you. So then there was this sense of, I don't know if I trust what you're doing to me because you're not really a doctor, you're just hired help. So there was that dynamic going on. But they also did get close to the front. And then entertainment, what they had to do. Most of the entertainment obviously was behind the lines. There was only so much you could do in a trench, just sitting there being constantly shelled and worried about gas. But, you know, just entertaining performances, ball play and whatnot. So here's the troop that I reenacted with. It was Company L of the 109th Infantry of the 28th Division. So this is a group. I'm in here somewhere real small. This is a World War I vet. So that shows you how old these photos are. I reenacted in the mid-2000s, maybe 2004 to 2008 or 9 or something like that. So here's a World War. These guys were from Philadelphia, and at that time he would march in the parade. So there's different events. This is no man's land. I don't know if you can see this, but this is the area that the reenactment group owns. So it is pretty impressive. Here are the different units, right? So here's a German soldier. These are all reenactors, German, French, right? They have the blue. A lot of these were French college students, so they would try, you know, if you were in the French unit, they would try to speak French. If you were Russian students. The British and the Irish with their kilts. And these guys are hardcore because they say, you know, obviously in World War I, that the guys wouldn't wear underwear, right? So these guys would do the same thing. Of course, they would be mooning the other side for their own entertainment. But that's, you know, that's how they would do it. The Canadians, Australians. So those are just some photos that I had taken of the different units. And then here I am with the parade. So this was me. Here's my son. So I'm wearing a reproduction. Guys back then had a lot smaller waists, so when you find an original uniform, if it's still in decent condition, those guys were much smaller. So my son, who's in high school, he's only 15, whoops, and but what he's wearing is original, but the helmet's original, all the gear, the rifle, the webbing, everything else is original because that's what you have. When I first started this reenactment, no one cared about World War I. You know, World War II it gets more attention, and rightfully so. There's a lot more just, you know, the good versus evil. World War I is more confusing, and it's harder to explain to the average person. And so I got to buy a lot of equipment, and it was cheap. You know, there's eBay. I'd go on eBay and buy a bunch of stuff, and now it's really expensive. So I have quite the collection. So I actually have a couple uniforms, but anyway. And then this is my daughter here who I recently kitted out with a Red Cross uniform. We gave a lecture at the Menneson Historical Society, and she got to wear her Red Cross. So when I spoke about the Red Cross, I'd bring her up and show off some stuff. But that's us marching in the parade. We always ended this in Lawrenceville at Allegheny Cemetery. They have a ceremony and whatnot. Last thing is just for any questions. I'd like to just say that on the table here, we have some things for sale. One is this book called Dear Mater. It actually just came out maybe 6 months ago. It's written by a board member of the Avonworth Historical Society. So I live in Ben Avon. We used to be called the Ben Avon Historical Society, but we recently changed our name to encompass the whole school district because the other areas like Kilbuck, Ohio Township, Emsworth, when they hear Ben Avon, oh, you guys are just Ben Avon. No, we're the whole area. So we're now the Avonworth Historical Society. Here's a soldier that actually had, he's from Ben Avon, he's from the area. They found his letters that he wrote to his mother over the years. And so it's a very easy read. It's $15, and all the money goes to benefit the Historical Society. But what's interesting about this book, which I obviously read, is you get into the mind, two things. One, you get into the mind of a soldier that what would inspire an American to go over and fight in a European war, right? During World War I, if a German went to go fight for Germany, no one batted an eye. All right, they're going to fight the European war. It's their mother country, fine. If they were going to go be a Nazi, that was a whole other ball game. But back in World War I, okay, we do business with Germany, go fight for Germany. But to hear his logic and reason why I got to go over there and kill some Germans, it's interesting, right? He's from an upper class family. What would motivate this guy to go do that? So that was something I had learned. I don't want to give away what I thought was the most amusing. But he does write letters to his mother, and you get to see how it progresses through the war. And also it's interesting how he's trying to explain what's going on while at the same time reassuring his mother that he's okay. And then we also have these calendars. These are 2019. They are photos from a John Cooper Bragdon. He was a famous photographer and etcher in the early 1900s, and there's pictures of Pittsburgh throughout the calendar, and in each page it has like a little bit of a historical description of what's in the photograph. So it's all his photographs. These are $10, and again, all the money supports the Historical Society. We also have some old newsletters, again, for $2. Again, it's just as a donation. So if you're interested, we have them over there. That's it. Any questions, or if you want to end it?
Very great presentation. Sure, we've got a lot of questions here.
There's a very fine World War I museum in Kansas City. I don't know if you know about that or not.
I haven't
Are
been to
there
that
others
one.
around the country that are good that you know of?
What's the one? It's the the War Museum over in, is it Maryland? It's like near the naval base. I'm failing to remember the name of it, but that has all the wars. But there's a lot of World War I.
This one is just World War I.
It's just World War I.
It's the top floor of a high-rise building.
Yeah.
It's very good, though.
Okay.
Just a comment. If you guys ever get overseas, I spent 2 years in Germany, and I went to the battlefield at Verdun. And you can get to see the real thing over there. And Verdun was one of the bloodier battles of the war. And in the basement is the bones of all the soldiers that were killed in it. And they have an actual trench and a restricted battlefield where you can't go. And we went on Armistice Day 1965. And it was rainy and muddy.
Yeah, see, you
and
got the real experience.
Really bad news. The second thing, what you didn't talk about was the actual brutal carnage, the loss of life both for the French and the British, which caused them to be very reluctant to go to war in World War II. That's
Sure.
why there's the big anti-war movement.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
How about the effect of the flu during that time?
Yeah, well, okay. Hey, that's a good thing I should advertise. On the second Tuesday in December, the Avonworth Historical Society, we're having a lecture. It's at the Anchor and Anvil coffee shop on Church Avenue in Ben Avon. we're having, and you can find it on our website, but we're having a speaker come and talk about the flu epidemic of that year. More people died of the flu than they did in battle. So we do have a medical doctor who's going to talk about the flu, speak to the 1918 flu in particular. So if you can make it, it's a free lecture. Just come to the coffee shop.
I just have a comment I read the other day that the average doughboy was 5'7" and weighed 141 pounds.
Yeah, I can believe it. When you look at the uniforms, they're that small.
Before they had penicillin, what was the medicine that they used to sort of take these or cauterize these wounds?
They would just clean them. Kept them clean with gauze, water. I don't know, so, but yeah.
Sulfur?
Maybe, okay.
Sulfa drugs? Or, John, do you have?
They really had no antibiotics.
No, they had to keep and continually keep it clean.
Right.
Although one thing of interest, and I was trying to get Allegheny Cemetery to do this, because in 2014, okay, it's the 100th anniversary of World War I, and they kind of reached out to me about doing something, and I said, I have a fantastic idea. They loved it. I says, you're a graveyard. You're good at digging holes. Why don't you dig me a trench? We'll get barbed wire. I'll make it look authentic. I'll come and stand in the trench and talk, and we'll let people reenact. And then when you're done, fill the hole back in. That's what you guys do all day long, and they didn't want to do it. So.
Okay, John.
Well, one thing they used to sterilize things and stuff like that was formaldehyde.
Okay.
They had like closets, right?
Yeah, they did a lot of boiling utensils as well.
Now, what are the sulfa drugs? What were they?
Those didn't come about until the 30s.
30s? Okay. Okay, I guess that's about it. Dan, great presentation. We thank you for
Thank
coming
you.
down.